Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. After reaching such great heights, how did India-U.S. relations fall so far and so fast? Let's get to the bottom line. A 35-minute phone call. That's all it took to shake the decades-old relationship between India and the United States. It was June 17th, and it followed 4 days of fighting between India and Pakistan. President Donald Trump announced the ceasefire, and then he claimed he'd brokered the truce. But Prime Minister Narendra Modi begged to disagree, saying no one forced his hand. And that's how this spiral began. Trump slapped 50% tariffs on Indian goods entering the United States, declaring that its economy was, quote, dead, and accused India of financing Russia's war in Ukraine by buying discounted oil from Moscow. For decades, the United States courted India as a counterweight to China. But while Trump was launching his war of words, Modi was cozying up to the leaders of Russia and China at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. So is the new U.S. attitude towards New Delhi actually pushing India and China and Russia closer together instead of further apart? Today we're talking with Anja Manuel, the executive director of the Aspen Security Forum, and she's author of This Brave New World, India, China, and the United States. And Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy and author of India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. Ravi, Anja, great to have you both on the show today, discussing what I think is one of the hottest issues right now, which is the seeming discontent between the leaders of India and the United States. And my sense is we've been trying to become close to India for decades, and it looks like it's gone into the gutter. So, Ravi, can you help us understand who has lost India from the U.S. perspective?
Well, I think, for the last 30 years, as you put it, the U.S.-India relationship has been becoming closer and closer. There's been wide bipartisan agreement that this is a partnership that, for many reasons, makes sense. And in the last few months, two things have happened, really. One is that when India and Pakistan had a conflict in the month of May, and the two sides were looking to de-escalate, and the United States did get involved. There was a call between President Trump and the leaders of those two countries. And Trump's version of events is that he led the de-escalation, that he got the two sides to pull back from what could have been a more serious conflict than what we saw. India, of course, has a long-standing policy of not acknowledging or accepting any foreign interference in bilateral matters, specifically on Kashmir and Pakistan. So it had a standard line in which it said, no, we disagree with what President Trump is saying here. Pakistan steps in right then and says, Mr. President, you should get the Nobel Peace Prize for what you did. So that instantly rocked the balance, where the United States was upset with India for not towing the line in that particular case. And then fast forward to the last few weeks, where the United States imposes 50% total tariffs on India, which includes 25% specifically on India's purchases of Russian crude because of that fact. So you add all of that up, and you have a country of 1.4 billion people that is very upset at the United States, not only for what it sees as belittling it. Trump has also called India a quote-unquote dead economy, but for not seeing that it has been acting in its own strategic interests, and that's being ignored here. So the relationship between the world's two biggest democracies, what President Obama once said would be the defining partnership of the 21st century, is now not looking like a partnership at all.
Ravi, I'm just trying to get my head around this. Are you saying that because of this Nobel Peace Prize, reticence from Prime Minister Modi, that you're seeing a case where the system is not doing what it's doing, and leaders have, in fact, made an impact? The pettiness has made a real impact on a huge relationship.
I think it is a factor. We will never know how much of a factor it is. Look, I'm a journalist. I've spoken to diplomats both in the White House and in New Delhi in recent weeks. The Indian side truly doesn't understand. They are befuddled. They don't get why the United States has seemingly turned so much, so sharply on this relationship. They suspect it is because Trump cares so much about being lauded for his peace efforts around the world, and specifically in this case, the India-Pakistan conflict, that he cares so much about that that he's willing to throw India under the bus. That is the Indian take. The American take is that, well, they were involved. They did make a phone call. They did help. And look, there is a history of U.S. officials actually playing a very important role in de-escalation in U.S.-Pakistan, India-Pakistan conflicts. But that is never publicly acknowledged in that way. Maybe later in memoirs, think of Colin Powell, think of Dick Armitage. But India is upset at how this has been handled. And on both sides, really, this could have been handled better.
Anja, I'd love to get a sense from you how this chessboard of, great stake, big stake actors, India, Russia, China, the United States are squaring off, because what we've just seen in the backdrop of what Ravi just shared is this fascinating meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where we see the leaders of China, of Russia, of India having essentially hand-holding kumbaya time is something that no one really expected, but would love to get a sense of both the drama of this, but also the stakes involved for the United States at this moment.
Yeah, the stakes are huge. And thank you for expanding it out to Russia, China, the other partners that India could bring to the table. Now, the optics this week of Modi hand in hand with President Xi and President Putin, they looked bad. But I don't think the theatrics of this summit match the underlying reality. And this gets back to what you and Ravi were just talking about. Leaders matter. And clearly, President Trump and Peter Navarro, who keeps saying aggressive things about India, have hurt Modi domestically in a way that is difficult for him. He's now being criticized by the opposition for being too close to the United States. And so Modi needs to visually move closer to China and to Russia. Underneath all that are big geopolitical forces that I believe push India and the United States closer and closer together, and China and India more and more apart. And let me talk a little bit about what those are. On the security side, I think your viewers know, Steve, that India and China have had big spats, including people dying along their high Himalayan border. The Indians are worried about the Chinese increasingly having their military, especially their submarines, around the Indian Ocean. And so over the past decade and a half, really, India and the United States have gotten closer together on the military side. Now, what you're seeing here is that the policies of the Trump administration aren't closely coordinated between what's going on with economic policy, where there is a big dust up with the Indians over trade, over oil being purchased from Russia, and what's happening on the security side, where I do think Secretary Hegseth and his team are looking for ever closer relationships with the Indians on the security side.
Ravi, I'm interested in whether this is just a surface spat, or are these, to come to what Anja just talked about some real key structural factors, whether this will go away and largely at the structural reasons why India and the United States, not just from geostrategic reasons, but also because of consumer reasons, because of the way technology is moving, that this is something that's been overblown.
Logic would suggest yes. The last 30 years would suggest yes. But the last few months haven't sounded very logical. Nothing about the ongoing trade talks between India and the United States has really added up, where the two sides haven't really been cognizant of the forces on either side that are leading them to say what they're saying. I think Anja made a very crucial point right now about domestic pressure. And look, politics has two dimensions always. There's the international side and the domestic side. And for Prime Minister Modi, there's a reason why India has always needed to pose high tariffs on dairy and agriculture, because they're outsized parts of the Indian economy. So the fact that that has become entangled in the things that Peter Navarro or President Trump are saying about India is regrettable. To your point, Steve, were we to come back to a wider trajectory, there is much more that unites India and the United States than divides them. And to Anja's point, there is much more that divides India and China than unites them. And I think that is a good framework through which to look at the last few weeks of summitry in China and some of the angst between India and the United States. We do need a correction on the recent angst. I don't know what it would take for that to happen. India and the US, by the way, are still talking behind the scenes on a possible trade deal. So if something emerges on that front, then maybe we could correct the balance here.
One of the real cornerstones of America's strategy in the Indo-Pacific is the Quad. Australia, Japan, India, the United States. Is the Quad dead right now?
I don't think the Quad is dead. I think the Quad is being intentionally very quiet. And this is a really important grouping for the following reasons. When I was in the US State Department several administrations ago, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia spoke to each other, but they were very careful to not do too much together on the military side and to not openly say that this was to help shape the rise of China. That has all gone by the wayside. It's not a formal alliance, but it does mean that these four very strong countries are exercising together all the time. There are growing US sales of military equipment to India. This was always a sticking point. India buys a huge amount of its military kit from Russia. Partly that is historical, as non-aligned movement. India has always been close even to the Soviet Union. Also, it was partly because the United States was hesitant to sell India its most advanced technologies. That is beginning to shift. And I think Ravi talked about Indus X, and now I think it's been renamed Indus Innovation. But the idea is to jointly produce some military equipment to keep doing all of these important exercises. And behind the scenes, very quietly, a lot of very substantial intelligence cooperation between India, US, and the other two Quad countries.
Ravi, what is India's geostrategic aspirations at this point? How does it look at itself in the world? Because when I look at demographics, and I look at China, China's a rising power, big power, but it's got a shrinking population. It's going to shrink fast. And people are very obsessed with China. I keep saying India is the powerhouse, rising superpower of the future, huge population, incredibly fast-growing economy, despite what President Trump said. But what does India want?
India is still biding its time. Look, China's GDP per capita is around about $12,000, $13,000 a year. India's is $2,500 a year. India is still, not even a middle-income country. So a lot of the growth that you're seeing, a lot of that will go into internal infrastructure. For the Indian middle class to expand is really the first order of business for Prime Minister Modi, and also job creation. Given the demographics you just mentioned, India is a very young country, average age 27, 28, median age. But that also means that you have to provide jobs for all of these people. Otherwise, instead of a demographic dividend, you have a demographic disaster. I think longer term, if you assume that India keeps growing at the 6-7% rate mark, which has kind of been its average for the last few years, what will happen is that India will grow in its global clout. And in terms of what it actually aspires to, there's always been a faction in India that was suspicious of the United States. And over the last 20, 30 years, that faction was to some degree silenced as India grew closer to the United States, and to some degree was willing to move further away from countries in Asia, for example. That movement has now, reemerged, where there are renewed suspicions about partnering with America. And I think American analysts should look at that very closely, because you don't want to lose India longer term. There's, again, so much more that should unite these two democracies than divides them. But the other thing to keep in mind here is, in a world in which the United States is seen as a less reliable partner, and in a world in which China talks about itself as a more reliable partner, I think what India is going to try to do in terms of its vision and ambition is to retain options, to create more geopolitical space for itself, to pick and choose partnerships in sectors, so technology and defense with the United States, but maybe trade with other countries. It's going to try to have it all in some senses. And in a fractured world, it is easier to have it all. I don't think any of that is to America's advantage, but that is a world that I think Trump is accelerating at this point.
Anja,
Steve, can I add to that?
go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's a really important point because we've talked about India, US, India, China. Those are important, of course, but India is becoming one of the key swing states in the international system, in often in a really positive way, and sometimes in ways that are maybe complicated for us. In the positive way, India has always been very protectionist for all of the reasons Ravi mentioned. Domestically, it is very difficult for farmers, for dairy farmers in India. Modi has to keep his domestic constituency together, and that sometimes means trade barriers. However, recently, India has signed free trade deals with the UK, with the United Arab Emirates, with Australia, with EFTA, which is a grouping that's led by the Swiss. So there's some positive momentum here. There's a huge amount of positive momentum between Al Jazeera's region, between the Middle East, especially the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, and India. A lot of longstanding relationship, positive relationship between Israel and India. And I would say, in general, it's a very positive thing that India is taking a larger role on the international stage, and we should help support it.
You know, when you kind of see the hypocrisy in a way that, you know, when you kind of look at, okay, we're sanctioning India because of energy purchases from Russia, you kind of look at that as one of the big factors. And you kind of see, well, Europe is doing this. Europe has basically got LNG exports to Russia. China and Turkey are rather big. So you see the inconsistency there. What if we begin to see some of the great power stakeholders in the world really begin aligning in a way where they're now trying to contain the United States? What would that future look like, Anja?
So I have trouble imagining that, with India as a key part of the alignment against the United States for all of the reasons that we've already talked about. India is deeply skeptical about China. They always talk a good game. For generations now, you see Indian and Chinese leaders get together and they talk about their joint tragic history of colonialism. They talk about the aspirations for economic growth for their people. And then they're silent. I mean, look at what just happened at this summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Summit. China offered a few loans. They said they want to cooperate more on AI. That sounds like it's more talk than reality, because the Indian AI researchers and technologists that I speak to they'll cooperate a little bit with China, sure, but they're much more happy to work with American tech firms here. You look at what's happening on the manufacturing side. Some Chinese manufacturing is happening in India, but it's American firms and European firms that have really taken up the call that Modi has made to manufacture more in India. Look at what Apple and Foxconn are doing. Those are big, big tectonic plates, Steve. And I hope I'm right with this, but I think this spat, which is a real one, and it's very serious because of all the domestic political issues we talked about, I hope that the tectonic plates are pushing in such a way that we will get through this spat and the US and India will continue to be aligned.
Ravi, you know, we've seen the kind of foreign policy tantrums from the White House towards various countries and governments, and then it largely I sort of think it largely works out. Does the world need to see Modi blink before Donald Trump will come out and relax things, or will we all get distracted by something else and this will sort of resolve itself? How do you sort of see the next iterations of this tension going?
I think it's quite possible that Donald Trump might get distracted. I'll tell you this, India won't get distracted. This is the India-US relationship mattered more to India than it did to Donald Trump. Modi faces significant domestic pressure on this fact in parliament, in the country's media. Sentiments in the country of India against America have really swung. Trump was actually adored in India 2 years ago. Today, he's a villain. That isn't going to change very quickly. And I think that will make it harder. It will constrain Modi's ability for some sort of a rapprochement with Trump personally. On separate tracks, I think there could be a trade deal because that would be advantageous to both sides to not have 50% tariffs on India. On oil, for example, I think it's entirely possible that Indian refiners will say, look, we were buying Russian crude because it was the cheapest crude on the market. Maybe we should diversify over time. That is stuff that could happen, of course. But it takes a while for these things to shift around. And then lastly, the oil question, you mentioned that Europe, to some degree, is buying LNG. China is buying Russian crude. Here's the thing that the United States is not acknowledging that I think is very obvious to Indian people and viewers and listeners, is that were India to stop buying Russian crude tomorrow, one thing would happen. It would buy it from somewhere else. The global price of crude would go up, and the price of the pump in the United States would go up, and you would have inflation. That is the reason why the Biden administration did not force India to stop buying Russian crude. It's as simple as that. Everything we're hearing from Trump and Navarro is just obfuscating that very simple fact.
Right. And Anja, just finally, could we actually see a resumption of really crazy tensions between Pakistan and India over this incident?
I think you could, and the tensions that we talked about in the beginning of the program in May, that boiled over in May, are not resolved. I think in this case, Pakistan is playing a weak hand extraordinarily well. No one quite knows what happened and how involved Pakistan was in the terrorist attack on India earlier this year. Having the Pakistani army chief be invited to the White House is unprecedented, but there are a lot of things about President Trump that are unprecedented. I think partly what you're seeing here, and part of the reason that Pakistan has been able to play its weak hand so well, is because in the United States government, you don't have a lot of senior diplomats in place yet at the table and able to give clear advice. Some of these issues that are so sensitive to the Indian side around, we don't have others mediate. We don't want a rehyphenation of the relationship. Those are things that experienced diplomats would normally say to the president up front, and I think here that may not have happened.
Well, we will wait and see and maybe have you both back to discuss that. Anja Manuel, Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum, and Ravi Agrawal, Editor of Foreign Policy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? Soon enough, we're going to find out whether the United States remains king of the hill or whether it kicks down its own hill. And we'll also find out if there are going to be other kings of hills like India or China and Brazil, maybe other nations, with the U.S. in a much less important spot. India matters. Sure, China's economy dwarfs India's, but China's population is shrinking now and India's is growing. America's economy grows about 3% a year, but India's is now growing 6% a year. That's not a dead economy. And in America's global competition with China, India was perceived as a must-have, vital partner for the U.S. So it's hard to believe that Trump will throw everything away. After the vanity, the pettiness, and the temper tantrums, these two countries will go back to finding how their core interests align. So this isn't the end of the story, and that's the bottom line.